Okay, good. Who wants to start? Good. Very good. And no, thank you. Thank you each and every time. So what we'll do is, as we do each and every time, we'll begin with a special psalm for the full and speedy recovery of Rabbi Steinsaltz, the author of this book, who had a stroke just over 2 years ago. And thank God he's well, but his speech still needs to come back. So we'll say a special prayer for his full health and mainly for that speech of his to come back and continue to enrich and empower our world. All right, so this is Psalm 45 that is connected to speech, to the power of speech. That's why we are saying this one. Again, for the full and speedy recovery of Rabbi Adin ben Rivka Leah, the son of Rivka Leah. All right, so we're up to the chapter that is titled The Way of Choice, an answer to ethics. Just to summarize maybe the last big idea, and that is that first this chapter speaks about an answer to ethics, or the way of choice of human beings, that we are each, he started by stating the obvious, that we're each unique, we're each individual, and therefore our purpose in life is also unique, because it's based on the beings that we are. Since we're each unique beings, so too is our purpose unique in our own lives. Now, our purpose can change. Our purpose has many different directions in life. It's almost shaped not just by us and our personality, but also by the opportunities that we're given and the places that we go to, and so on and so forth. Rabbi Steinsaltz says that maybe the biggest test in this life of purpose is to be in this world, as he puts it, maybe not necessarily in this chapter, but I've heard him say this many times. We said this in the previous class, I think, but that we're in this world, but we're not made of this world. We have to be in this world and fulfill our purpose here on earth. But we also have to remember that we're above this world, and we are heavenly beings that are placed in this world to fulfill our purpose in this world. And finding that balance between spirituality and materialism, so to speak, between being in this world yet not of this world, between being within yet staying above, is really one of the greatest challenges of man. And that's really what he's speaking about. All these fluctuations between those two modes is really the test of man. To not be sucked by this world, even though we might be in it. Yet not to flee too much also to the heavens without fulfilling our purpose here on earth. It's that idea that we are essentially spiritual beings in a human experience. Not human beings in a spiritual experience, but spiritual beings in a human experience. And reminding ourselves of that spirituality, yet also of the duty to be in that human experience, in that lowly, so to speak, in that earthly experience. So that's really what he has been speaking about, really in a nutshell, up until now. Let's continue on page 80, speaking of trying to integrate, again, those two modes together. With this unusual synthesis, does anyone want to read as a fundamental approach, that line? So I suppose we're all using the same books, but in this book, it's on page 80. I know there are other editions. No? Everyone is the same book today. Okay, right. It seems to be two separate realms, or even two opposite realms. You have the realm of prophecy, which is the metaphysical realm, and yet you have the realm of mitzvot, which really deal with this world. It's fascinating because most of the mitzvot are physical mitzvot. Name a mitzvah and you'll see that it's purely physical. There's nothing spiritual in a dollar bill that you give to tzedakah, yet it's part of this world. Yet it is maybe the most spiritual thing you'll have, because again, you connect this dollar bill, this very earthly materialistic thing, to God himself by performing that mitzvah. That's when you bring heaven and earth together in that bill, in that $1 bill, if you want to use that example. But every other mitzvah, whether it's tefillin, that uses the skin of a cow, that's what parchment is made of today. Back in the day, it was skin of whatever kosher animal was in Iraq, they used deer skin. And in Iran, they use goat skin. Whatever it was, doesn't matter. But you use an animal skin for a mitzvah. Mezuzah is the same idea. Name the mitzvah, and you'll see that it's as physical as could be. Yet, as we are focusing on the detail of that physicality, we cannot lose sight of the tremendous holiness that it can bring down, of the light of God himself You know, the Zohar, the foremost book of Kabbalah, speaks of different levels of holiness. And not without going into all the intricacies, but the highest level of holiness is the holiness that can be found in a mitzvah. That's the holiness that shines its light all the way to the throne of glory, what's called Kiseh HaKavod, all the way to the throne of glory. While many of our prayers, many of our deeds really only hit certain worlds in order, for example, for study of Torah. Not just the Zohar speaks about that, other books of Kabbalah speak about this, the Tanya speaks about this in chapter 40. But for books of Kabbalah, for Torah study, to really go all the way to the throne of glory, for that mitzvah, studying Torah is a mitzvah, for that mitzvah to shine its light all the way to the throne of glory, it needs to be done with as much selflessness as possible. You're studying not for yourself, then it's selfish. You're not studying for your wisdom. Many people study just to enrich their intellect. And you don't really care about God. You only care about yourself. Many people study for a title. I'm studying to become a rabbi. Great, but that's not the study of Torah that's wanted of you. That's also, again, very selfish. Much of the study of the Torah that happens in this world can be very, very selfish. So how can you create a mitzvah that is selfless and therefore that can really shine to the highest of levels, to the throne of glory, when it is done with complete humility, when it's done for the sake of God, and even when it's done when you don't feel like it. If you don't feel like learning, yet you're learning nonetheless, that's lishma, what's called, for the sake of it, for the sake of the mitzvah. That mitzvah shines all the way through. Now, as opposed to Torah study, as opposed to prayer, Rabbi Steinsaltz, I remember, I used to meet him, the author of a book here, but I used to meet him often when I lived in Jerusalem, in the synagogue where he was the rabbi, the Tzemach Tzedek Shul, what it's called until today, in the old city. Tzemach Tzedek Shul has tremendous history. It's one of the only shuls that survived the 6-Day War and survived other horrific episodes in the old city. But he was appointed as the rabbi of that shul, which is a Chabad shul, by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, which is an interesting thing in and of itself. But I remember that I would visit him very often, and then we would, speak during services, before services, after services. By the way, Rabbi Steinsaltz prayed with such meditation, such focus, that he would stay there almost all day long on Shabbat. He would go home at 3:30, 4 o'clock. And the sight of seeing him pray was a sight to treasure. But, so I remember him saying many times, pointing to the ceiling of the Tzemach Tzedek, and he says, you see, this synagogue is a very holy synagogue. Why? Because many of the prayers are stuck here on the ceiling. They never went higher than that. So you're surrounded by prayers in this building. That's Rabbi Steinsaltz's way of saying that you're not all prayer. Not all Torah study goes all the way to the throne of heaven. But what's interesting is that mitzvahs is a different story. If I do a mitzvah, then that mitzvah in and of itself can shine right through, because it's where heaven and earth kiss, so to speak, as we've spoken about before. And then whether you did it with the right intention or with the wrong intention, a mitzvah invites God to earth. It merges heaven and earth together. It takes what he calls here this unusual synthesis and brings it so together that its light shines all the way up to the throne of heaven. And that's why, in that famous Talmudic discussion, which I don't know if we spoke about in the past, but a famous discussion about what's more important. Is Torah study more important than action? Talmud Gadol or Maaseh Gadol? That's the question the Talmud asks in the Tractate of Kiddushin. What's greater? Is Torah study or action? Mitzvah. And the Talmud concludes that we're debating this for 3 days. And eventually it concludes, Talmud Gadol shemevi lidei maaseh. In other words, study is great because it brings to action. What does that mean? They didn't answer the question. But what it means is that your study is only a good study if it brings to action, which really means that action is great. But that's the point. That again, what, Jackie? What we said? No, yeah, right. So the action in of itself, again, Kabbalistically, is what can really bring light all the way to the heavens. I think this has halachic implications also. I know we've mentioned this example before, but say You walk into a cemetery and you have your tzitzit out like this, you have to tuck them in. Why? Because the souls that are in the cemetery will see that mitzvah that you're doing. This is a cell tower, so to speak, from heaven to earth and back. The cemetery, their grave. That's why when you have a yard site, for example, you pray at someone's grave. That's their channel to this world. But you still want to communicate with your loved ones. You still want to communicate to this world. That's really a question that's asked in Hasidic thoughts. So what if you can't get to? And there's many stories about that. I'm going to give you two answers. There are more than two answers. One answer is, and I'll tell you a story that's connected to this answer, but one answer is through meditation. You really focus and contemplate heavily on your loved one, and that evokes your loved one back to you. It's almost like if I were to stare at someone in a supermarket, it could be a complete stranger, and I stare at someone, he's not looking at me. But after a while, he'll look back because that stare evokes a response, energetically, spiritually. Same here with souls. If I think of someone heavily, that will make them think of me. It's true vice versa. Sometimes all of a sudden, without any contemplation, I think of someone that's deceased. That's because they're staring at me. So through meditation. And I'll tell you this, but there's a story about Mendel Futerfas. We've mentioned him in the past, but Mendel Futerfas was a Hasidic Jew who suffered in the Russian Gulag for 20 years, and I had the privilege of meeting him. Eventually moved to Israel, and he had many, many good stories about his times in Russia, etc. But he was a Chassid of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and in Russia they were very much afraid to send letters, because if the mail that they sent was intercepted, and they would discover, gosh, this man is writing a letter to a rabbi, that means he's involved in Judaism, that means it's illegal, that means he should go to jail. So he wrote a whole letter one day, Mendel Futerfas, the story he told. And after writing the letter, he said to himself, I can't send this. I'm going to get in trouble. So he just put it away. He didn't send it. 3 weeks later, he receives mail. From who? From the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself, answering all of the questions that he had. This is a true story by him. I heard this from Mendel Futerfas himself. Answering all the questions he had. And he asked himself, whoa, how could that be? And in a way, I think the answer that we gave answers this question. When you contemplate, and that someone, if he's in tune with you, and certainly the Lubavitcher Rebbe's soul was in tune with everyone with everyone. So it evoked an answer back. That's one. Two is also to either study their teachings, if they had any, or devote yourself to a mitzvah that they were devoted to. Then you'll have almost their soul's desire meeting your soul's desire. Soul's desire was towards a specific mitzvah. Say their mitzvah was, again, to do tzedakah. If you do tzedakah on their behalf, then you'll have your soul meeting their soul, and your soul's desire meeting their soul's desire. That's another way. But going back to the example, so if I have to tuck in the tzitzit, my tzitzit, if I walk into a cemetery, why? Because the souls that might be channeling to this world at that moment will see me and my tzitzit, and will see this mitzvah that I'm doing, and they'll be very jealous. And I don't want to make souls jealous, so I tuck it in. Now, why would they be jealous? They're in heaven. They're in the Garden of Eden. It's the best place in the world. It's not. It's not. There's a higher place. The throne of glory that souls can't reach, only through mitzvahs. And when we do a mitzvah like this, or like any other mitzvah, then it shines all the way up there, and the souls are jealous of it because they can't reach it. That has, again, that's where Kabbalah and Halacha meet. An idea that has a halachic implication. Yes, at yard sites, it's become an expression. We wish the person who's commemorating the yard site that the neshama should have an aliyah, which means the soul should have an ascent. Why ascent? Because they can ascend through the deeds, especially through the deeds that we do in their loving memory. The souls derive much pleasure and they ascend. The depth of their pleasure, it becomes deeper and deeper and goes higher and higher. Now, because God is infinite, the ascent is infinite. So it can go higher and higher, absolutely. Gentiles have their own ways of doing them. They have 7 mitzvahs. They have mitzvahs. That's how we call them. Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. They have 7 mitzvahs. One of them is to believe in the oneness of God. The other one is to not murder, etc. But they can connect. Their mitzvahs are the same as our mitzvahs. This particularly is not one of their mitzvahs. So they won't be jealous as much as Jews would be jealous of it, because it's not a tool they can use. Let's continue, unless there's other comments or questions. Yes, it's interesting because to take this maybe a step further or a step more Kabbalistically. So, and we spoke about this, if you remember, in the chapter of the soul of man, I think chapter 4 or whatever it is, 3, yeah. So sometimes we have to contemplate souls for them to think of us, right? Like we spoke about before. When it's with our parents and our loved ones, or even very close friends, that contemplation is not necessary so much. Why? Because we really our souls come from the same tree, so to speak. And we're connected no matter what. And even when they're gone, it's only their bodies that are gone. Their souls remain as connected as possible. And that's why we would feel the presence of our parents, even though they may no longer be here, as strongly as we felt them when they were alive. Maybe even more. Because, again, it's a matter of souls. And those souls really come from the same tree. And their connection has been sown by God from the beginning of times. That's why it really doesn't surprise me at all that you feel the presence of your mother, because it's a soul-to-soul connection there. That's designed by God. That doesn't need our contemplation. I shared the story a long time ago, but I really believe in this. I never forget this, but I remember that I was visiting this woman at a hospice not long ago, a few years ago, at Mayo Clinic, Sherman House, hospice. And Shiri Etzioni, some of you may know, she's a doctor in that hospice there in our community. She says, well, there's this woman dying, you should come visit her. So I came, and then I was told that she's a Holocaust survivor. So I asked her, wow, you're a Holocaust survivor, what kept you strong all these years? And she responded something that's very much connected to what we're speaking about. I'll never forget this. She said, it was the words of my mother that kept me strong all these years. I said, what words of your mother? She said, well, when the Nazis stormed into our town, just a few days before that, my mother called me into her room, and she said to me, look, I hear the Nazis are coming, and I don't know what's going to happen to us. I'm hearing all sorts of stories. But I know that you love play, she tells her. And I want you to know that life is like a play. What makes a good actor, a good actor, a good actress, a good actress is that they play their role to the fullest. So whatever happens to us, she tells her, you have to promise me that you will play your role to the fullest. That's what will make you a good actress in this play of life. And then she told her, and if something does happen to us and you never see me again, I want you to know that just like in a play, I'm not disappearing. I'm just going behind the curtain. And I'll be watching you if you are playing your role to the fullest. So you better not disappoint me. The Nazis stormed into the village a few days after that, and they never saw each other again. But she knew that her mother was watching. She knew that that presence was always there. So she had to play a role to the fullest. And it's a beautiful image, but we really, really believe in that. There's no doubt. Our loved ones continue to be behind the curtain watching us, so connected to us soulfully. I told her, by the way, that it's interesting that she used the analogy of play because it couldn't be more accurate. It's not only do the mothers and our loved ones go behind the curtain after they pass on, but also we also believe that's one of the 13 principles of faith of Maimonides. We believe in the resurrection of the dead. What happens at the end of a play? The actors that were behind the curtain come back on stage and they hold hands with everybody and take a final bow, right? That's what happens. So I said it's the same thing here. The mother's going to come back, is going to hold our hands, and we're going to be reunited once again. That's really the belief.
I had a kind of similar experience. My dad died when I was 4. And lately, I had been thinking about him. I don't know why. I don't normally, because I barely remember him. And I found 2 pictures of him, which I showed you.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't believe that I had this hunger to look at these pictures.
Mm.
And I thought, that must be him telling me, you're okay, I'm watching you.
Right, there's no doubt. We wholeheartedly believe in it. Does anyone want to continue? Jewish life and thought. Now, I would say very few are the individuals who know exactly what proper place and measure and time are meant for heaven, for our spiritual yearning, for that spiritual ecstasy, and for going back here on earth, doing the mitzvot and immersing ourselves in making earth heaven. Very few people know that. But I will say this, that it's in the contradiction, as Rabbi Steinsaltz here calls it, that we find God. It's in that ability to be here, but not to be here. Again, as we said, to be within yet stay above. I'm reminded just of Rabbi Nachman of Breslev, the Hasidic master's favorite line, or maybe most famous line, was that "Ein yashar misulam," there's nothing more straight than a ladder, and ve'ein shalem milev shavo, and there's nothing more wholesome than a broken heart. What does it mean? It's a contradiction. A ladder, by default, is crooked. But no, there's nothing more straight than the ladder. Why? Because there's nothing more straight than that crookedness that leads you step after step after step to the heaven. It's through that contradiction, through that struggle, that you grow. By the way, true on a very simple level. If I were to ask each and every one of you, and ask myself, what were the points of growth in your life? What were the points of the most growth in your life? That probably will relate to points of challenges. It's the challenges that make us grow the most. And same year, it's in that contradiction, in that crookedness of the ladder, that we're able to be our ascent is able to be as straightforward as possible. That's that. And there's nothing more wholesome than the broken heart. Because it's specifically when the heart is broken that we find the wholesomeness of God. That our heart all of a sudden opens up and is able to absorb God himself. It's almost like Leonard Cohen's famous line, right? Forget the perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light comes in. It's that crack that allows the light to come in. But it's exactly that fluctuation between heaven and earth, that contradiction that we feel inside, that we want to be heavenly. Our flame, like King Solomon says in the book of Proverbs, Ner Hashem nishmat adam, a flame which is like the soul, right? The soul is like a flame. That flame that wants to erupt and leave the wax, yet knows that it needs the wax in order to illuminate, otherwise it would just evaporate. It's that that really enables us to be as divine as could be, as purposeful as could be. That's the idea. Now, we have to, I think it takes tremendous honesty to be honest with ourselves, to know, whether acting heavenly is really acting heavenly, or is just maybe selfishness, just for my pleasurable feelings. And when doing a mitzvah is appropriate or not. In most cases it is. Because again, mitzvahs doesn't really matter the intentions. Sometimes I prefer one mitzvah over another mitzvah. Someone needs me to visit the sick. And I say to myself, you know what, instead of visiting the sick, I'm just going to go and pray. Both are mitzvahs. But we know very well that the mitzvah of visiting the sick is probably what's needed most. So you have to be honest enough to really make those decisions. I think it takes tremendous honesty. I also think that sometimes we're not honest enough with ourselves, therefore we need mentors. We need what's called aseh lecha rav, make for yourself a teacher, as the ethics of our fathers teaches us, people that are objective enough and know us well enough to guide us in the right direction. And I also think it takes a little muzzle, a little luck, a little heavenly help, siyata dishmaya, what may be called as the help of heaven. It takes a little bit of that too, there's no doubt, of God coming to help us out. But we have to be cognizant of this contradiction and knowing how to best channel it. It's part of living in this world where we sometimes are blinded by the growth. It reminds me of, a caterpillar in that 3-week, I think that's that 3-week journey in a cocoon trying to metamorphosize into a butterfly. If someone doesn't know about the caterpillar becoming a butterfly, they might think, oh, the caterpillar is suffering. Let me try to cut the cocoon or break it all together. Sometimes you have to allow the challenge to be the challenge without interrupting it. But knowing yet at the same time that you'll turn yourself into a butterfly by allowing it to happen. If you try and cut that, then it's gonna ruin it. That's right. There's a great line that says that we often are professionals at telling God how great our problems are, but sometimes we have to tell our problems how great God is. That in and of itself, I think, can help us, levitate the stress from these troubles, from that contradiction. And it's interesting because what's the word for crisis in Hebrew? It's fascinating. The word for crisis in Hebrew is mashber. Mashber. It's a crisis. Now, it's interesting to note that the word mashber in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, in fact, the word mashber is used in the Torah itself in a different context. Mashber does not mean crisis in the Torah. Mashber really refers to the bed on which a pregnant woman would give birth. That bed is called a mashber. Why? Because really in every challenge there's growth. There's a pregnancy giving birth to a child. We have to, sometimes we're so much in pain, right? We haven't experienced this year, but the ladies I'm sure in this room have. It's so harsh, it's so painful that we can't think of the child coming. We have to believe in that child coming from that contradiction, from that pain. It's the first mitzvah in the Torah. First mitzvah in the Torah is puru, be fruitful and multiply. Ein shalem bilev shavu. That's correct. Yeah. Now, there's an expression in Hebrew that really comes from again, there's an expression in English that really comes from biblical Hebrew, speaking of that same word. Lishbor, shavu, mashber. So, don't you say that in English, to break bread? You say that? Lishbor lechem. It's from the Torah. To break bread. What does that mean? When you're breaking bread, that means you invited someone, you're making a connection. And sometimes that breaking makes a connection, a deeper connection. Connection of love, a connection of divinity, really. It's interesting to note that, again, speaking of this fluctuation, back and forth, this in-between space, this contradiction. So, it's very often used in marriages. I don't know if we've spoken about this, but it says that Zachu, if a man and a woman really merited, Shechina Shora Beinehem. The Shekhinah, the divine presence, dwells not on them, not upon them, in between them. What this really means is that where the divine presence dwells in relationships? When you create that space in between. If you say, no, I'm right, you're wrong. Or if there's complete division, it's me and you, there's no in between, there's no us. And the divine presence isn't there. When you create this in between, in that fluctuation, that's where God resides. That's also, that stems from this big idea. It's in that contradiction, that brokenness, in that in-between space, where I break my ego. I reduce my ego, at least. It's not about me. It's about creating that space. That's where God resides. I don't know, I think I mentioned this, but Rabbi Fruman, who was a rabbi in Israel, a controversial rabbi, but very, very, a giant of a man, Rabbi Menachem Fruman, he was a rabbi of a place called Tekoa. And people would come from all around Israel to interview him because he was in the news for many reasons. But when they would come to him, he would say to them, don't interview me. You can interview God in this place. I can show you God. Maybe he can give you an autograph. You can take a picture of him. And the journalist would say, what do you mean? And he would then go to his wife, Hadass, I think was the name, and he would put his arms around her. And he would say, look, in between her and I, that's where God is. You can take a picture of you taking a picture of God. But it's that, again, that in-between space that really creates godliness. Man and a woman have almost the same name in Hebrew, same root name. Ish is a man and Isha is a woman. The difference between the two is that Ish has a Yud, Aleph, Yud, Shin, and Isha has a Hey, Aleph, Shin, Hey. Now, Hey in the woman and Yud in the man really are both letters of God. What happens if God doesn't reside there? If God says, I want to take my Yud out of this man and my Hey out of the woman, what letters are left? In the Ish, Aleph, Shin, which means fire, Esh. In the woman, again, if the Hey leaves, she's also left with Esh, Aleph, Shin, which also means fire, of course. Esh and Esh. God said, so the Talmud says, Lo zachu, if they did not merit having the divine presence, esh or chaltan, a fire comes and consumes them. Fire consumes them. God leaves and the fire consumes them. So how does God reside? Beinehem, in the in-between. If we create an in-between space, then there's a ish and there's an isha. And then there's a harmony. So just these last 3 minutes, I want to develop this point one more time, maybe in a slightly different direction. So it's that contradiction within man that really invites God. What's interesting is this. If you look at almost every biblical hero that exists, they form their relationship with God. Moses is a good example. Abraham is a good example. When they protested God. Abraham, in last week's portion, was standing there at the gates of heaven, at the gates of Sodom, saying, God, you can't destroy this city. And that, in a way, furthered his relationship with God. Moses didn't want to accept upon himself the yoke of leadership. And when he finally did, he was arguing with God all the time. Yet, that furthered his relationship with God. Name the biblical character, I'll name you that deep contradiction, that find expression in their arguments, in their protests of God. And in a way, I think that's also part of that bringing down of the divine presence. It doesn't mean that we have to be, robots. Yes, God, I accept this, Maybe Islam does that. Islam means to subdue. You have to be completely subdued. Judaism doesn't believe in that. Judaism believes that there's a relationship with God. And sometimes, just like in other relationships, I don't agree. So I'm allowed to voice my opinion. If I can't voice my opinion, then it's not a relationship. Then it's maybe a master-slave relationship, but it's not a healthy relationship. But it's specifically through that contradiction, through that protest, through that argument, that I can form that relationship, that my relationship can go further. And I think that's what that contradiction, just from a different perspective, is really what makes Judaism so special. It's what prayer is about. A lot of the prayer is not just saying, God, you're great, Hodul Hashem Kitov, God, we're grateful. But it's also saying, Shema Koleinu, listen to our voice, you Refaenu, heal us. It's not right that I'm sick. It's saying to God, sorry, step in. I'll step in, you step in. And it's in that relationship that we have of argument where we each try to make a step towards the other in that in-between space between us and God, that God resides. That's, I think, the beauty of Judaism. Yes, yeah, absolutely. And a lot of Psalms 13, Adana tishkacheni netzach. Until when are you going to forget me, God? You've forgotten me. Or he says, Kuma, he says to God, Ad matay nechshavnu katzon latevach. Until when are you going to treat the Jewish people like sheep that are led to slaughter? David protests a lot in these Psalms. We spoke about the relationship between husband and wife, but it's also between us and God. It's in that protest, in that back and forth, that God really resides. It's in that type of contradiction too. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. Shavua Tov. Have a beautiful week, day. Okay, we'll see you. And welcome again. So good to have you. Really. Okay.